In the summer of 1944, the most powerful army ever assembled was being bled white by dirt and shrubbery. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded beyond the most optimistic projections. The beaches were taken. The beachhead was secure. Over 1 million men and hundreds of thousands of vehicles had poured ashore, and yet 6 weeks after D-Day, the great liberation of Europe had ground to a halt in a patchwork of ancient farm fields bounded by earthen walls that no tank could cross and no general could wish away. 7,000 miles away, in the war rooms of Washington and London, commanders studied maps covered with arrows that had stopped moving. They read casualty reports that read like dispatches from the First World War, from Verdun and the Somme, from battles of attrition that had consumed a generation. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, young Americans were dying at rates that threatened to break the will of a nation that had believed this war would be different from the last. Then a sergeant from New Jersey looked at scrap metal on a beach and saw something that the generals had missed. What he saw would help break the deadlock and change the course of the war. The planning staffs had known about the Norman hedgerows before the invasion. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed the distinctive pattern with perfect clarity, thousands upon thousands of small irregular fields enclosed by dense vegetation. Some officers had even studied the terrain in person during pre-war visits to France. British intelligence had compiled reports on the bocage region dating back years. Intelligence officers had noted the terrain features in their assessments. Briefing documents mentioned the bocage, the French term for this type of countryside. Allied commanders were not ignorant of what awaited them, but knowing about a problem and understanding its true nature are fundamentally different things. The officers who planned Operation Overlord had focused their attention on the beaches, on the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, on the challenge of getting ashore against defended positions. The hedgerows were something to deal with later, after the beachhead was established, after the breakout began. No one had fully grasped that the hedgerows themselves would become the primary obstacle, the killing ground where the campaign would stall. The hedgerows of Normandy were not hedges in any sense that Americans understood. Back home, a hedge was a decorative boundary, a row of trimmed shrubs separating suburban lawns. A man could push through such a hedge if he had to. A vehicle could certainly crash through one. The Norman bocage was something else entirely, an agricultural fortification system that dated back more than 1,000 years. Each field in the bocage region was surrounded by an embankment of earth and stone, accumulated over centuries of clearing and cultivation. These embankments rose 4 to 6 feet from the ground level of the adjacent field. Their foundations were packed solid by generations of root growth and settled soil. On top of each embankment grew dense vegetation, oak trees and hawthorn bushes and tangled brambles that added another 6 to 10 feet of impenetrable growth. The total barrier often exceeded 15 feet in height. The root systems of this vegetation had interlocked over countless growing seasons into something approaching reinforced concrete. A man could not force his way through. Axes and saws made slow progress against the tangle of wood and thorn. Even explosives had limited effect, blasting holes that were quickly blocked by falling debris. The embankments themselves were too steep for infantry to climb easily, and too solid for vehicles to push through. The density of this maze defied comprehension. Military analysts studying aerial photographs counted approximately 3,900 individual hedgerow enclosed fields within a single area of 8 square miles. That worked out to nearly 500 separate enclosures per square mile. Each field averaged perhaps 200 yards across. Each was bounded on all 4 sides by these ancient walls. Each required its own assault. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had inspected the Norman defences during the spring of 1944, months before the invasion came. The Desert Fox immediately recognized the bocage as defensive terrain of extraordinary value. He understood that the hedgerows would channel any attacker into predictable paths, and that defenders who knew the ground could exact a terrible toll from those who did not. Rommel ordered his troops to prepare positions that exploited every advantage the terrain offered. German soldiers dug fighting holes directly into the earthen embankments, creating miniature bunkers that were virtually invisible from above and protected on three sides by packed earth. Some positions were reinforced with timbers cut from the hedgerow trees themselves. Communication wire linked positions together, allowing defenders to coordinate their fire and call for support. Machine gun teams were positioned at opposite corners of each field, their fields of fire interlocking to cover every inch of open ground. Mortars were pre-registered on the gaps in the hedgerows, the openings where paths and farm lanes offered the only routes through the maze. Artillery observers occupied the tallest trees, directing fire with precision onto advancing Americans. Snipers concealed themselves in the dense vegetation, picking off officers and radio operators to disrupt American command and control. When the first American infantry units pushed inland from the beaches and entered the bocage, they discovered what the maps had not revealed. To cross a single field meant advancing 200 yards across open ground, while machine guns raked them from multiple angles. The fire came from positions they could not see, from embankments that looked like solid walls of vegetation. If they hit the dirt to take cover, mortar rounds began falling among them within seconds, the tubes already aimed at likely positions. If the infantry managed to reach the far hedgerow, they found German soldiers dug into the embankment itself, men who had to be killed one by one in close combat. If they cleared those positions and pushed through to the next field, another identical gauntlet awaited. The same machine guns at the corners, the same mortars registered on the gaps, the same invisible enemy. Progress was measured in fields, not miles. A company might take 3 fields in a day and suffer 30 casualties doing it. The battalion behind them would take 3 more fields tomorrow and suffer their own losses. At that rate, crossing the Norman bocage would take months and consume divisions. The tanks that were supposed to support the infantry and break the stalemate were worse than useless. The American M4 Sherman was a capable vehicle on open ground, with good mobility and a reliable engine. But in the bocage, every advantage became a liability. When a Sherman approached a hedgerow embankment, the driver faced an impossible choice. He could try to crash through the barrier, but the earthen base was far too solid. The tank would bog down, engines screaming, tracks churning mud, going nowhere. It would sit there, immobilized, while German infantry closed in with anti-tank weapons. Or the driver could try to climb over the embankment, tilting the tank backward as it scaled the slope. At the moment the Sherman crested the top of the hedgerow, its bow rose into the air at a steep angle. For a few critical seconds, the tank's thin belly armor was exposed to anyone watching from the other side. A German soldier with a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket could destroy the tank with a single shot from a concealed position mere yards away. The Panzerfaust was a weapon of terrible simplicity. A disposable tube with a shaped charge warhead, it could be manufactured cheaply in enormous quantities and issued to regular infantry. It required minimal training to operate. Point at the target and pull the trigger. The rocket-propelled warhead could penetrate the armor of any Allied tank at close range. In the bocage, where every engagement happened at close range, the Panzerfaust turned every German infantryman into a tank killer. Tank crews learned to dread the hedgerows. They watched other tanks try to climb the embankments and burst into flames when Panzerfaust rounds punched through their bellies. They heard the screams of men burning alive inside steel coffins. They knew that their turn would come. The alternative was to avoid the fields entirely and use the roads and lanes that wound between the hedgerows. But the Germans had those covered too. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover straight stretches where tanks would be silhouetted against the sky. Mines were buried in the road surfaces, pressure plates waiting for the weight of a 30-ton vehicle. Trees were felled across the lanes to create obstacles that forced tanks to stop, while German gunners took aim. A column of tanks moving down a bocage lane was a column of targets. The led vehicle would hit a mine or take a hit from a concealed gun. The tanks behind it would be trapped, unable to advance past the burning wreck, unable to turn around on the narrow lane, unable to leave the road without running into the hedgerows that lined both sides. German mortars would begin falling among the stalled column. More tanks would burn, more men would die. The casualty figures accumulated with sickening speed. The 83rd Infantry Division entered combat in the bocage for the first time in early July 1944. These were fresh troops, well trained, but untested in battle. On July 4th, Independence Day, they attacked toward the town of Saint-Denis. After a full day of fighting, they had advanced approximately 200 yards. They had suffered 1,400 casualties, killed and wounded and missing. They had taken 2 prisoners. The mathematics of such combat were unsustainable. An infantry division had roughly 14,000 men. At the rate the 83rd had suffered losses on July 4th, the division would cease to exist as a fighting force within 2 weeks. No army could absorb such attrition and continue to advance. The story of Hill 192 illustrated the grinding nature of bocage warfare. This modest elevation southeast of the town of Saint-Lô offered observation over the surrounding countryside and controlled key road approaches. The 2nd Infantry Division was tasked with capturing it. Their first assault, launched in mid-June, was a disaster. Over 1,200 Americans became casualties in the attempt. The hill remained in German hands. For nearly a month, the 2nd Division fought for that single piece of high ground. They attacked and were repulsed. They reorganized and attacked again. They brought up more artillery, more tanks, and more infantry replacements. Not until July 11th, after massive preparatory bombardments that churned the hillside into a moonscape, did American soldiers finally plant their flag on the crest of Hill 192. One hill, 1 month, thousands of casualties, and there were hundreds more hills, thousands more fields between the Americans and their objectives. The 29th Infantry Division had already been bled at Omaha Beach on D-Day. They had suffered more than 1,000 casualties in the first 2 hours of June 6th, cut down in the surf and on the sand by German machine guns firing from fortified positions above the waterline. The survivors had fought their way off the beach and inland through the coastal defences. They had proven themselves in the hardest test any soldier can face. Now they faced the bocage, and the dying continued. Day after day, field after field, the 29th pushed towards Saint-Lô. By the time the city finally fell on July 18th, the division had accumulated casualties that would eventually exceed 7,000 for the Normandy campaign. Some rifle companies had been virtually annihilated and rebuilt multiple times with replacements who would themselves become casualties within days. Across the American sector, the pattern repeated with numbing consistency. Attack, take casualties, gain a few hundred yards of cratered farmland, regroup, attack again. Friendly artillery fire intended to suppress German positions sometimes fell short and killed American infantry. Friendly aircraft, trying to support ground troops, occasionally bombed their own side. The confusion of combat in terrain where no one could see more than a few yards multiplied the opportunities for tragedy. Studies conducted after the war found that artillery and mortar fire caused approximately 3/4 of all American casualties in the Normandy campaign. Soldiers caught in the open fields had no protection from shells that burst among them. Even those who dug foxholes found that the soft Norman soil offered poor protection against direct hits. Men died in holes they had scraped with their entrenching tools, killed by fragments that rained down from above. General Omar Bradley watched his first army bleed and could see no way out. The original invasion plan had called for American forces to reach a line running from Lessay on the west coast through St. Lo to Caumont in the east by roughly 3 weeks after the landings. They did not secure that entire line until July 27th, more than 7 weeks after D-Day. Every day of delay gave the Germans more time to bring up reinforcements, more time to strengthen their defenses, more time to prepare for the next American attack. The campaign was supposed to exploit Allied advantages in mobility and material. American factories had produced tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, and aircraft. American training programs had graduated hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The weight of American industry was supposed to crush German resistance through sheer overwhelming force. Instead, the bocage had negated every advantage. Mobility meant nothing when tanks could not move. Numbers meant nothing when attackers funneled into kill zones. The war had become a battle of attrition, and attrition favored the defenders. Bradley needed a solution. He needed tanks that could break through the hedgerows instead of dying on top of them. He needed some way to crack open the bocage and restore the mobile warfare that Allied planners had envisioned. Without a breakthrough, the campaign would continue to grind forward at enormous cost, or worse, might stall completely as casualties mounted and morale crumbled. The official army engineers had no answer. The specialized equipment developed for the invasion, the duplex drive tanks with their flotation screens, the flail tanks designed to clear minefields, the armored bulldozers meant to breach beach obstacles, none of these had been designed for the problem of the hedgerows. The engineering establishment had focused on the challenges they anticipated, not the challenge that had actually emerged. The solution would come not from the engineering establishment, but from the soldiers themselves, from men who faced the hedgerows every day and had powerful motivation to find a way through them. In the first weeks of July 1944, multiple American units began experimenting with improvised solutions. The 79th Infantry Division reportedly had a working hedge cutter device operational by July 5th. The 747th Tank Battalion tried mounting timber prongs on their Shermans to grip the embankments and prevent the tanks from climbing. Ordnance workshop crews in various divisions welded scrap metal to tank hulls in attempts to create cutting or piercing devices. The British were conducting similar experiments with their own armour. Among those working on the problem was a small group from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a mechanized unit from the New Jersey National Guard that had landed in Normandy shortly after D-Day. The squadron's official combat history would later record that 4 men collaborated in closest cooperation to develop what became known as the Rhino device. They were Major Arthur C. Person, Captain James G. Depew, Captain Stephen M. Litton, and Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III. Culin was 29 years old, born on February 10, 1915, in Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he had worked as a sales promotion assistant for Shenley Distillers, helping to market whiskey and other spirits. He had joined the New Jersey National Guard in 1938, seeking perhaps adventure, perhaps extra income during the lingering Depression years, perhaps simply the camaraderie of military service. When war came, his Guard unit was federalized and sent overseas. His family history included a connection to American industry. His ancestry traced back to Colonel Curtis Grubb, a Revolutionary War-era ironmaster who had owned Cornwall Ironworks in Pennsylvania. The Grubb family had helped forge the weapons that won American independence. Perhaps there was something in the bloodline that inclined Curtis Culin toward working with metal, toward seeing possibilities in raw steel that others missed. The concept that emerged from the collaborative discussions was elegant in its brutal simplicity. The problem was that tanks either got stuck trying to push through hedgerows or exposed their vulnerable bellies trying to climb over them. The solution was to give the tank a way to dig into the embankment, to bore through the base of the hedgerow while keeping its nose pointed down rather than up. If steel prongs could be mounted on the front of a tank, prongs that would bite into the earthen embankment and anchor the tank's bow, then the tank could drive forward through the hedgerow under its own power. The prongs would prevent the tank from riding up over the obstacle. Instead, the Sherman would push through the base of the embankment, its thick frontal armor facing whatever enemy might be waiting on the other side, its gun ready to fire the moment it emerged. The raw material for the prototype was readily available, lying on the beaches where the invasion had begun. The Germans had planted thousands of obstacles along the Normandy shoreline to stop landing craft from reaching the shore. Among these were Czech hedgehogs, steel barriers constructed from 3 crossed-eye beams welded together at their centers to form a 3-dimensional star shape. Each hedgehog weighed between 440 and 530 pounds, heavy enough to remain in place against the force of waves and tides. These obstacles had an ironic history. They were originally invented in Czechoslovakia in 1935 and 36 by a military officer named Major František Kasich. Their purpose was to stop German tanks from invading Czechoslovakia. Hundreds of thousands were manufactured and deployed along the Czech border fortifications. When Hitler's army rolled into Czechoslovakia in 1939, they captured these obstacles along with everything else. Now the Germans had deployed them against the Allies, repurposing Czech defences as beach obstacles on the French coast. After the successful landings, the hedgehogs littered the Normandy beaches as scrap, their original purpose defeated, waiting to be cleared by engineer troops. Their steel was strong and readily available. Their beams could be cut into sections of the right length and welded into new configurations. The enemy's own defences would provide the material to defeat the enemy's positions. Within days, the first prototype was ready for testing. The device consisted of 4 or 5 steel tusks, typically about 18 inches long, cut from hedgehog beams and welded to a heavy crossbar. This crossbar was then mounted across the front hull of a Sherman tank, positioning the tusks to angle slightly downward and forward, like the prongs of a giant fork. The theory was straightforward. When the tank drove into a hedgerow at speed, perhaps 10 miles per hour, the tusks would bore into the earthen embankment like the teeth of a plough. The crucial effect was that the tusks would pin down the tank's nose, preventing it from riding up and over the obstacle. Instead, the tank would push forward and slightly downward, driving through the base of the hedgerow while dirt and roots and vegetation cascaded over its hull. The first successful test must have seemed miraculous to the soldiers who witnessed it. A problem that had appeared insoluble, that had cost thousands of American lives, was being overcome by scrap metal and welding torches. The tank did not climb, it did not get stuck, it did not expose its belly to enemy fire. It simply pushed through and emerged on the other side, gun ready, armor intact, crew alive. A Sherman with tusks had become a rhino. On July 14th, 1944, Major General Leonard T. Gero telephoned General Omar Bradley with news of the device. Bradley understood immediately that this might be the breakthrough he needed. He drove to the demonstration site to see for himself. arriving to find Gero and several staff officers clustered around a light tank fitted with the cutting apparatus. Bradley later described the demonstration in his memoir. The tank backed off and ran head-on toward a hedgerow at 10 miles per hour. Its tusks bored into the wall, pinned down the belly, and the tank broke through under a canopy of dirt. The general watched in astonishment as the hedgerow seemed to explode outward to make way for the Sherman bursting through. Bradley called the solution so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. Here was an answer that required no specialized manufacturing, no shipments from factories thousands of miles away, no months of development and testing. It could be built in the field, from materials already at hand, by soldiers using equipment they already possessed. It could be deployed within days, not months. That same day, Bradley ordered mass production. The general's response demonstrated the organizational adaptability that would prove decisive throughout the war. He understood that the device was useless if only a few tanks carried it. The entire armored force needed to be equipped before the next major offensive. Speed was essential. Bradley directed the 1st Army Ordnance Section to begin manufacturing the Rhino devices immediately, around the clock, with every available welder and cutting torch. He dispatched Colonel John Madaris to the United Kingdom to have tanks modified before they shipped to France, so that newly arriving armour would already carry the hedge cutters when it rolled off the transport ships. He arranged for additional arc welding equipment and trained welding crews to be airlifted to Normandy to accelerate the work. And Bradley imposed a critical security measure. The devices were classified top secret. No tank equipped with a hedge cutter would be permitted to use it in combat until Operation Cobra launched. The Germans must not learn what was coming. Tactical surprise could multiply the effect of the new weapon. The production effort that followed was a masterpiece of improvised military logistics. Ordnance crews worked day and night, cutting steel from the captured beach obstacles and welding it to tank hulls. Acetylene torches hissed and sparked around the clock. The workshops operated under camouflage netting to hide the activity from German reconnaissance aircraft that still occasionally flew over the American rear areas. Shifts rotated continuously, fresh workers replacing exhausted ones who stumbled off to sleep for a few hours before returning to the cutting torches. Officers who had never wielded welding equipment learned to help where they could. Everyone understood that the success of the coming offensive might depend on how many tanks could be equipped before the launch date. Within 11 days, from July 14th to July 25th, over 500 Rhino devices were manufactured and installed on 1st Army tanks. By the time Operation Cobra launched, 3 out of every 5 tanks in the 1st Army, 60% of the armoured force carried the hedge cutters. The transformation had been accomplished in less than 2 weeks through sheer determination and organisational flexibility. The British were working on the same problem through independent channels. The Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers developed their own version of the device, which they called prongs. British workshops manufactured over 2,100 cutting devices for Sherman, Cromwell, and Churchill tanks. Multiple solutions emerged simultaneously because the problem was urgent, and the underlying principle was straightforward once someone demonstrated that it could work. Sergeant Curtis became an instant celebrity within the American forces. He was photographed with his invention, decorated for his contribution, interviewed by correspondents, and recorded by Armed Forces Radio for broadcast back home, but he consistently tried to share credit with his collaborators and with the other soldiers who had developed similar devices independently. The official recognition came in the form of the Legion of Merit, awarded to all 4 of the principal developers from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Each man received the same medal, the same citation, acknowledging that the device was a collaborative achievement rather than the work of any single inventor. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944. It was preceded by one of the most devastating aerial bombardments of the entire war. Approximately 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, and B-24 liberators dropped over 3,000 tons of high explosive and fragmentation bombs on a concentrated target area 3.5 miles wide by 1.5 miles deep. Medium bombers and fighter bombers added their own ordnance to the deluge. The earth shook for miles around. The bombardment was intended to annihilate the German defences and create a corridor of destruction through which American armour could pour. The planning called for the bombs to fall on German positions just south of the Saint-Lô to Perrier Road, with American troops pulled back safely north of the road to avoid friendly fire. But combat is chaos, and chaos respects no plans. Some aircraft dropped their bombs short of the intended target area, their ordnance falling among American troops who were supposed to be safe. Approximately 111 American soldiers were killed by bombs from their own aircraft. Over 500 more were wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, who had come to observe the operation. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre of operations. The tragedy cast a shadow over the opening hours of Operation Cobra. Men who had survived the bocage, fighting died under bombs dropped by their own countrymen. The margin between safety and death had been measured in yards, and the aircraft had erred by yards. But the offensive could not wait for morning. The survivors pressed forward into the smoking ruins that had been German defensive positions. What they found was devastation. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best equipped armoured formations in the German army, had been caught directly under the bombardment. Tanks were overturned by the concussion of 1,000-pound bombs. Armoured vehicles were buried under tons of displaced earth. Soldiers were entombed alive in foxholes that collapsed around them. Survivors wandered in shock, deafened and disoriented. The commander of Panzer Lehr later estimated that 2/3 of his division became casualties in the bombardment, dead, wounded, or incapacitated by blast effects. The elaborate defensive positions that the Germans had prepared, the machine gun nests and mortar pits and anti-tank gun emplacements, were simply erased from the landscape. Where there had been a coherent defensive line, there was now a zone of craters and debris. When the American tanks rolled forward, they carried the Rhino devices into action. The hedgerows that had cost so many lives now fell before them. Tank after tank pushed through the embankments, tusks biting into earth, hulls ploughing through root and soil, emerging on the far side with guns ready. The infantry followed through the gaps the armour created, advancing across ground that would have cost them dearly a week before. The transformation in the campaign's tempo was dramatic. Before Operation Cobra, American forces in the bocage had averaged roughly 1 mile of advance per day, measured in blood and exhaustion. On July 28th, 3 days after the offensive launched, the 4th Armoured Division advanced 12 miles in a single day and captured the town of Coutances. The Germans were not just retreating, they were running. By July 30th, Avranches had fallen into American hands. This ancient town controlled the gateway between Normandy and Brittany, the hinge on which the entire German position in western France depended. The 4th Armoured Division covered 25 miles in 36 hours to seize it. The 8th Corps sustained fewer than 700 casualties from July 28th through July 31st, while capturing over 7,000 German prisoners. The ratio of losses had reversed itself completely. On August 1st, General George Patton's 3rd Army became operational and began pouring through the gap that Cobra had created. The mobile warfare that Allied planners had envisioned for the entire campaign was finally underway. Patton's tanks swept south and west into Brittany, east toward Paris, fanning out across the French countryside with a speed that the Germans could not match. German units that tried to stand and fight were outflanked. Units that tried to retreat were often overrun before they could establish new defensive lines. The German 7th Army, which had fought so effectively in the bocage, now faced encirclement. By mid-August, Allied forces had trapped large portions of the German army in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the resulting battle. The Wehrmacht in the west had suffered a catastrophic defeat from which it would never fully recover. Within weeks, Paris would be liberated. Within months, Allied forces would stand on the German border. The stalemate of the bocage was broken, and the war in the west entered its final, decisive phase. Military historians have debated the precise tactical significance of the hedge-cutter devices in the breakout. Some scholars argue that once Operation Cobra succeeded and the front became fluid, the rhinos were seldom needed because tanks advanced along roads rather than cutting cross-country through individual fields. The bocage mattered most when the lines were static and every field had to be fought for separately. Stephen Zaloga, a respected armour historian who interviewed veterans of the Normandy campaign, noted that tankers had mixed feelings about the device. Some said it worked effectively but was hard on the crew, the violent impact of ramming through a hedgerow, jolting everyone inside the tank. Others said they hardly ever used it once the breakout began, since the roads offered faster routes than cutting through fields. Martin Blumenson, the official army historian who wrote the campaign history titled Breakout and Pursuit, concluded that the device was of little tactical value during the actual breakout, since tanks advanced on roads rather than cross-country. But Blumenson acknowledged its importance as a morale factor, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. This psychological dimension may have been as significant as any tactical effect. Armies run on morale, soldiers who believe they can win fight differently than soldiers who believe they are trapped. For 6 weeks, American tank crews had faced the hedgerows with dread, knowing that each embankment might be their death. The rhino devices gave them hope. They gave them agency. They gave them the sense that American ingenuity could overcome obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. The hedge-cutters also demonstrated something about the American way of war, the willingness to improvise, to adapt, to solve problems through practical experimentation rather than waiting for solutions to come down through official channels. The sergeants and captains who developed the rhino did not wait for headquarters to provide an answer. They built their own answer from salvaged steel and determination. That spirit of practical problem solving would prove as important as any weapon in the American arsenal. Sergeant Curtis did not have long to enjoy his moment of fame. His unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, was among the first Allied forces to enter Paris in late August 1944. They had crossed France in the wake of Patton's breakout, part of the great sweep that liberated millions from German occupation. But the war continued, and in early November the 102nd moved toward the German frontier into a dark forest called the Hurtgen. This dense woodland in western Germany, near the Belgian border, would become one of the bloodiest battlefields of the war, a place where American divisions were ground down in fighting that some veterans compared unfavorably to the bocage. On November 2nd, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Culin was moving through the Hurtgen forest when he stepped on a German anti-personnel mine. The explosion shattered his left leg. As he fell, his body triggered a second mine. The blast severely wounded his right thigh. A fellow soldier from Cranford, New Jersey, a man named William Bateman, rushed to help. Bateman used his belt as a tourniquet, probably saving Cullen's life. by stopping the bleeding from his shattered leg. When Bateman went to summon medical help, he himself stepped on a mine. The explosion took his leg. Both men were evacuated through Belgium to England and eventually back to the United States. Culin received a Purple Heart Medal to go alongside his Legion of Merit. He was discharged from the army in September 1945, having served his country at great personal cost. Culin returned to Cranford after the war. He married a woman named Bernice Enright and went back to work at Shenley Industries as a salesman, the same profession he had practiced before the war. He walked with difficulty on his damaged legs. The couple divorced in the early 1950s. He never remarried. In the years that followed, Culin's contribution was not forgotten by those who understood its significance. President Dwight Eisenhower, who had commanded the Allied forces in Europe during the war, met with Culin personally. Eisenhower appreciated the story of the hedge cutter as an illustration of the ingenuity and determination that had carried the Allied cause to victory. On January 10, 1961, just 10 days before leaving office, President Eisenhower delivered a speech to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. In that address, he recalled the invention of the hedge cutter and what it represented about American problem solving. There was a little sergeant, Eisenhower told the assembled engineers. His name was Culin, and he had an idea. Because this seemed like a crazy idea, they did not even go to the engineers very fast, because they were afraid of the technical advice they would get. The idea went from captain to major to colonel until someone did something about it, and that was General Bradley, and he did it very quickly. Eisenhower used the story to make a point about the importance of listening to ideas from unexpected sources, about the danger of letting bureaucracy stifle innovation. The biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked, he said. Curtis Grubb, Culin III, died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. President Eisenhower, now in retirement, sent a telegram of condolence to his parents. Culin was buried at Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, a few miles from the town where he had grown up. In 1992, a bronze memorial plaque was installed at the Cranford Municipal Building to honor his memory. The plaque bears Eisenhower's assessment of his contribution. Sergeant Culin's contributions to success in the Normandy breakout reflected Yankee ingenuity at its best. Today, an original rhino device survives at the Normandy Victory Museum in Carentan-les-Marais, France. The museum occupies the site of a former American airfield, one of the temporary bases built in the weeks after D-Day to support the air campaign over France. Among its extensive collections is a 1943 Sherman tank with a hedgerow cutter still attached to its hull, the same type of improvised weapon that helped break the deadlock 8 decades ago. The story of the hedgerow cutter carries lessons that extend beyond military history into questions about how organizations solve problems and how innovation happens under pressure. It is a story about the limits of centralized planning. The official engineering establishment, with all its expertise and resources, had no solution to the bocage problem. The engineers had prepared for the challenges they anticipated, the beach obstacles and the fortifications and the minefields. They had not prepared for an obstacle that had existed since the Middle Ages, because it had never occurred to anyone that ancient earthworks would stop modern tanks. The solution came instead from soldiers in the field, men who faced the problem directly and had overwhelming motivation to find an answer. They did not wait for guidance from above. They experimented with whatever materials they could find, learned from each other's successes and failures, and eventually developed devices that worked. Decentralized innovation solved a problem that centralized planning had failed to anticipate. It is a story about the importance of rapid adaptation. From the first demonstration of the Rhino device to Bradley on July 14th to full deployment for Operation Cobra on July 25th took 11 days. In peacetime military bureaucracies, innovations typically require months or years to move from concept to implementation, passing through layers of testing, approval, and procurement. Bradley cut through the entire process because he understood that speed mattered more than perfection. The hedge cutters were not optimal devices. They were rough and crude, welded together from battlefield debris by soldiers who were not professional engineers. A properly designed hedge cutter, developed through normal channels, might have worked better, but a properly designed hedge cutter developed through normal channels would have arrived months after the bocage fighting was over. The crude version that arrived in time was infinitely more valuable than the perfect version that arrived too late. It is a story about the relationship between technology and confidence. The Rhino devices may or may not have been tactically decisive in the breakout itself, but they demonstrated that problems which seemed impossible could be solved with ingenuity and determination. That lesson extended beyond the hedgerows. Throughout the war, American forces would face unexpected challenges that required improvised solutions. The spirit that created the Rhino, the willingness to experiment and adapt rather than wait for official answers, would prove as valuable as any piece of equipment. And it is a story about the forgotten contributions of ordinary people to extraordinary events. Curtis Culin was not a general or a famous inventor. He was a sergeant from New Jersey who worked in sales before the war and went back to sales after it. He collaborated with others who had similar ideas. He built on concepts that multiple soldiers were developing simultaneously. He happened to be the one whose work caught Bradley's attention at the right moment. The men who developed the hedge cutter devices in the 102nd Cavalry and the 79th Infantry and the 747th Tank Battalion and British workshops and dozens of other units were not seeking fame. They were trying to solve a problem that was killing their friends. They used the materials at hand, the beach obstacles left behind by a defeated enemy, and they created something that changed the course of a campaign. Most of them went home after the war and lived ordinary lives. Their names appear in unit histories and award citations, but they are not the names that history books remember. The generals get the monuments and the biographies. The sergeants get forgotten. Perhaps that is inevitable. Perhaps it is even appropriate. The men who invented the hedge cutter were not fighting for recognition. They were fighting to survive, and to help others survive, and to win a war against an enemy that threatened everything they valued. They saw a problem, and they fixed it. Then they moved on to the next problem, and the next, until the war was won, or they were killed or wounded and sent home. But their story deserves to be told, because it reveals something true about how wars are actually won, not just by grand strategy and overwhelming resources, though those certainly matter, not just by heroic individual combat, though that matters too. Wars are won by thousands of small innovations, each one solving a particular problem in a particular place at a particular time. The cumulative effect of all those solutions, all those adaptations, all those improvised answers to unexpected challenges is what determines victory or defeat. The hedgerow cutter was one such innovation among many. It emerged from desperation and ingenuity, from collaboration and competition, from the accumulated knowledge of soldiers who learned what worked and what did not work by watching their comrades live and die. It was not elegant, it was not sophisticated, it was steel tusks welded to a tank hull by men working through the night under camouflage netting, racing against time to equip an army before the next great offensive. And it worked. Against ancient earthworks that had endured for centuries, against defences that had bled an army white, Against a problem that had seemed unsolvable, it worked. That is the story of the hedgerow cutter. That is the legacy of Sergeant Curtis Culin and the men who worked alongside him. And that is the spirit that helped win a war. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from the Second World War with people who want to understand what actually happened beyond the simplified versions in textbooks. Subscribe to stay connected with these forgotten histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their families to history enthusiasts discovering these stories for the first time. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for honoring the unsung heroes who changed history when their moment came.